The last thing I heard from my family was not an apology. It was not a warning, or even a goodbye. It was laughter, my aunt's laugh, high and uncontrolled, cutting through the cold October air as her SUV pulled back onto the highway, and the red glow of her taillights faded into the dark somewhere north of Sudbury. I stood at the edge of a rest stop off the Trans-Canada, the kind of place that exists only to mark distance between somewhere and somewhere else. A single fluorescent light buzzed under the shelter. The parking lot was empty except for a dented blue pickup that had been there when we arrived. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions. I stood there and waited, because I was still certain, even then, that this was a mistake, that she would come back. She didn't. My aunt had looked after me since I was 11. After my parents were killed in a collision on the 401 near Kingston, I grew up in her house in Barrie, slept in her spare room, ate at her table. I said thank you at every meal because I understood, even as a child, that I was a guest in someone else's life. She made sure I never forgot it, not cruelly, not at first, just quietly, small comments about how things were done before I arrived, gentle reminders that I was lucky to have somewhere to go. She called it guidance. She called it love. I was 29 years old, standing at that rest stop, and I had not yet learned to stop believing her. The argument started near North Bay. My cousin was driving, my aunt's husband in the passenger seat, the two of them in the front, my aunt and me in the back. We were supposed to be heading up to their cottage near Temagami for the long weekend, a trip she had invited me on last minute, which I now understand should have been the first warning. She never included me in anything last minute. Everything with her was calculated. Somewhere near the Sudbury turnoff, my cousin brought up the time I lost my job at the accounting firm 2 years earlier. Not brought it up, announced it like a verdict. He said I had never recovered, that I was still renting a basement apartment in Barrie, still living paycheck to paycheck, still occasionally borrowing money from my aunt that I was always a little late paying back. My aunt's husband stared at the road. My aunt turned to look at me and smiled. She said she had always worried I couldn't take care of myself. My cousin laughed. He said he had $20 that said I couldn't last one night out here without begging someone to call her. $20, that was the number, that was the bet. I didn't fully understand what was happening until the car stopped at the rest stop. My aunt said she needed to use the restroom. I stepped out to stretch my legs, and then the car pulled away. I ran 3 steps before I stopped myself. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe because some part of me had always expected this. Maybe because the gravel beneath my feet felt more honest than anything that car had been carrying. My phone was in my jacket, which was in the back seat. My wallet was in my bag, also in the car. I had my hoodie, my jeans, my sneakers, and a half-eaten granola bar I found in my pocket. I also had, for reasons I still can't explain, a small blue pen I'd picked up in a doctor's waiting room 3 weeks earlier and never returned to my bag. I kept that pen the entire way back. It became the most important thing I owned. The temperature was dropping fast. Northern Ontario in October doesn't negotiate. I waited under the shelter for 30 minutes, watching the highway, before I finally accepted that no one was turning around. I started walking. The shoulder was narrow, gravel rough under my soles. Transport trucks passed close enough that the draft hit my body like a shove. Each time I flinched and steadied and kept moving. I had no idea where the next town was. I just knew that standing still felt like handing them exactly what they wanted. After maybe 40 minutes, a flatbed slowed beside me. A man in a Carhartt jacket leaned out his window and looked at my face without asking for an explanation. He asked if I was all right. When I said no, he offered me a ride to the next Tim Hortons, about 20 minutes up the highway. His name was Frank. He hauled lumber. He had a daughter around my age who called him every Sunday, and he always answered, he said, because you never know. He didn't press me on what had happened. He just drove, and the heater in the cab worked, and for a few minutes I let myself be warm. He dropped me at a Tim Hortons just outside Chelmsford. I walked in with nothing. No card, no cash, and stood at the counter the way you stand when you're waiting for someone who isn't coming. A woman behind me, buying 2 large double-doubles and a box of Timbits, looked at me once and ordered a third coffee without a word. She put it in my hands and left before I could ask her name. I sat in a corner booth and held the cup with both palms and let the heat move through my fingers. The place was quiet. A couple of highway workers, an old man with a newspaper, a teenager doing homework on a cracked laptop. Normal people in a normal place, and I was sitting among them with crumbled granola in my pocket trying to understand how I had let this happen. The answer came slowly. the way it always does when you've been avoiding it for years. My aunt had never actually trusted me. She kept me close the way you keep something that might embarrass you if it wanders too far. When I got into university, she said the program wasn't practical. When I left a relationship that was making me miserable, she said I had given up too easily. When I got the accounting job, she called it a good start, like I was 12 and had just learned to spell my own name. Every achievement in my life had been met with the same quiet reduction, the same careful insistence that I wasn't quite enough yet, that I needed more guidance, more time, more of her specifically. And I had believed her. For 18 years I had believed her. I wrapped my hands tighter around the coffee cup and felt something shift inside me. Not quite anger, something closer to exhaustion with myself for being so slow. The woman behind the counter, Donna, told me she got off in 45 minutes and could drive me to the nearest motel if I needed. She made the offer so plainly that I didn't know how to refuse. On the short drive over, she hummed along to a country station and told me the motel had good water pressure, which she said was more than most places in the area could claim. At the front desk, she paid for one night before I could object. "You pay it forward to someone else someday," she said. "That's how it works up here." I stood in the motel room for a long time after she left. The mirror above the bathroom sink showed me someone I barely recognized, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the cold or the walking. I looked like someone who had just put down something very heavy and wasn't yet certain her hands were empty. The notepad on the nightstand had the motel's name printed across the top in blue ink. I uncapped my pen and I wrote everything down, not to process it, not to plan anything, just to make it real. The argument in the car. The way my cousin smiled when he said $20. The way my aunt's husband kept his eyes on the road instead of turning around. The way my aunt looked at me in that last moment. Not with cruelty, but with something that scared me more than cruelty ever could. Certainty. Like she had already run the calculation and was simply watching the math confirm itself. I wrote until my hand ached. Then I lay down and stared at the ceiling until the anger organized itself into something steadier. I woke before 6, cold and stiff but awake in the sharpest way I had been in years. I found a CAA roadside brochure in the nightstand and used the map on the back to figure out roughly where I was. I washed my face, combed my hair with my fingers, and walked back out into the morning. The rain had stopped. The highway was silver gray and wet, and the air smelled like pine and asphalt, and the particular quiet of early morning in the north. I started walking south. An older couple stopped at the lively turnoff. They introduced themselves as Doug and Irene, retired teachers from Sudbury heading back after visiting grandchildren. Easy people. The kind who fill silence without making it uncomfortable, who offer things without making you feel like a project. Irene pulled a pair of wool socks from her tote bag, because she said my sneakers were wrong for this weather and she couldn't just watch. Doug said they were headed toward Barrie, and I was welcomed the whole way. I said yes. I sat in the back seat and watched the Canadian Shield pass outside the window, and thought about the drive north, just days before, sitting in the same position in my aunt's car watching the same highway, still hoping that this time would be different. That maybe she was trying. Somewhere around Perry Sound, Irene turned around in her seat and looked at me with the kind of calm that good teachers seem to carry everywhere, even in retirement. "You're going back to deal with something," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. She nodded. "Just remember, they don't get to define what happens next." I turned those words over for the rest of the drive, not because they were new, but because this time they came from someone who wanted nothing from me afterward. We reached Barrie late afternoon. They dropped me at my corner, insisted I take Irene's number, made me promise to call when I was settled. I stood on the sidewalk and watched them pull away and felt the specific warmth of being helped by people who had no reason to help you. People who did it anyway, because that was who they were. I went to my apartment first, showered, changed, found my spare bank card in the kitchen drawer where I kept it since my wallet was stolen 3 years ago. A habit my aunt had always called paranoid, which I now thought of as the smartest thing I had ever done quietly against her advice. I ate something. Sat at my table in the silence of my own apartment, in the air that smelled like my things, my coffee, my life. Then I drove to her house. The kitchen light was on. Through the window I could see them at the table, my aunt, my cousin, my aunt's husband. The same table where I had eaten every Christmas dinner from age 11 to 24. The same chairs. The same window above the sink, where a spider plant she'd owned for 30 years sat in its clay pot. I walked in without knocking, because I had always been told I didn't need to. They looked up. My cousin started talking. I set the notepad on the table. Every page was covered. What happened in order in my own handwriting. The rest stop. The walk. Frank and his cab heater. The woman who handed me a coffee without asking my name. Donna. Doug and Irene. The times, the locations, the highway signs I could still read in my memory. 2 days compressed into something they could not rearrange. My aunt looked down at it, then up at me. I watched her face move through 3 or 4 things before settling on the one she always used when she was cornered. Concern. We were worried about you, she said. We tried to reach. You have my phone, I said. My cousin opened his mouth. I looked at him and he closed it again. I pulled the notepad back from the table and held it under my arm. I'm not here to fight, I said. I'm not here to be talked around or explained to. I'm here to say one thing clearly, so there's no confusion later. I looked at my aunt. I'm done. I'm done with the loans that come with invitations. I'm done with the invitations that come with tracking. I'm done with every form of help you've ever offered me that was actually just a way of keeping score. My aunt's husband was staring at the spider plant. My aunt said my name, soft, the way she said it when she wanted me to feel young again. If you try to tell anyone a different version of what happened, I said, I have it all here, in my handwriting, and I have Donna's first name and Irene's number, and Frank knows exactly where he picked me up on the Trans-Canada. I paused. I have a lot of receipts for someone who left without her wallet. I turned toward the door. We're your family, my aunt said. Her voice had gone softer. I recognized that frequency, the one designed to pull me back, the one that had worked for 18 years because I had never understood that it was a frequency, not a feeling. I stopped in the doorway. You were my family, I said. That stopped the moment you drove away. I just took 2 days to catch up. I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat. The air smelled like my own coffee cup and the pine air freshener my best friend gave me, and the drive-through crumbs I still hadn't cleaned up, small, ordinary mine. That night, my best friend drove over with butter chicken from the place on Dunlop Street, and sat with me at my kitchen table until past midnight. I told her most of it. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always loved most about her. I kept the notepad. Not as a weapon and not as evidence. I kept it because it was the first thing I had written in 18 years that was entirely mine. No one else's version, no one else's framing, no softening for someone else's comfort. 2 days on a highway through northern Ontario, written down in pen on a motel notepad, while the heat clicked on and off and the room smelled like cleaning product and old carpet. It was the truest document I had ever produced. There is something that happens when you are left with nothing, no phone, no wallet, no one coming, and you still keep moving, something that has nothing to do with surviving the road. It took me 2 days walking through the cold with borrowed socks and a stranger's coffee to finally understand that the problem had never been that I was incapable. The problem was that I had spent 18 years inside a story someone else was writing about me, and I had been too grateful to notice. I don't live in that story anymore. What I have now is a small apartment in Barrie with my own lease and a kitchen drawer with a backup bank card in it, and a best friend who answers on the second ring. What I have is a pen from a doctor's waiting room that I still carry in my jacket pocket, for no reason I can explain except that it was with me when everything else was gone and it stayed. Some things you don't put down once you've held on to them through the worst night of your life. Some things you just keep.